This program is being brought to you by Alltel of New York. The telephone has been a part of Jamestown since 1880. Throughout the years, the city has grown, and Alltel is proud to have grown with it. And Roby Henderson Insurance Agency. The third generation is now serving the needs of this community with the same care and concern of the original founders. And Chase Lincoln First. As the First National Bank, Chase Lincoln has been serving this community since 1853.
And so we went to Celeron, and there we took in all of the rides, and we looked around, and we had a good time. We listened to music.
But you're talking about Brooklyn Square. As I remember it, the first I remember of Jamestown was most of the business was down around Brooklyn Square. And then the railroad came across there. And then the business started to climb up the hill.
And they had one streetcar that ran up there. They had an upstairs to it and a winding stairway that went up to get to the second floor, and they called the double-decker. And kids delighted in getting up there to ride on that.
A century of life, a century of living. For the next 60 minutes, you'll be hearing about the history of the city of Jamestown. Not dates and places like the history books you had in school, but living history from people that lived it. Throughout the show, you'll hear from these three ladies, as well as others that were born in or around Jamestown in the early days of this century. As with the stories your grandfather told you, some memories are subject to interpretation, and so we have also included information from people that have made the history of this area their life's work. You hear from Candy Larson and Helen Ebersol of the Fenton Historical Society, Russell Fuscus of the Great White Fleet Museum, and city historian Dolores Thompson. You'll see hundreds of photographs, and each and every one of them is from Jamestown and Chautauqua County. And you'll even see some rare movie footage taken right here in our backyard. So sit back, and if it's a cold night, take a lesson from our past.
I'd sit in the house, stick my feet in the oven. We had one of them old-fashioned stoves. You open the oven door and stick your feet in there. We'd crack nuts and make molasses taffy. We'd spend
and eat popcorn.
Yeah, and eat popcorn.
But you're talking about Brooklyn Square. As I remember it, the first I remember of Jamestown was most of the business was down around Brooklyn Square. And then the railroad came across there. And then the business started to climb up the hill. The business went up the hill to about 2nd Street, and boy, you were really uptown then. And then it went up as far as 3rd, but still wasn't when I was younger.
And then just beyond that, on the right-hand side, this is on Institute Street, was a blacksmith who had his shop there. And we could smell the horses' hoofs, as he'd put their shoes on. And we would stop and watch him very often, going to school, because I went to several years to St. James, and we would stop and watch the blacksmith. And that was fun. On the corner of Market and Brooklyn Square, extension of Brooklyn Square, there was, which was really a piece of Forest Avenue there, was this city market. And there was the place where people got their meats and the butter and eggs and every darn thing you'd want. You could even get rabbits at one time there. And the meats usually were on the outside booths, and they were all vying with each other for the customers. And people went to the same ones usually as they did, from week to week. Some of them would try somebody else once in a while, but most of them had their regular customers that came there regularly, and they had nice fresh meats. They were good butchers, and then in the middle, you see, the stalls were for the big hunks of cheese, great big pieces of cheese, and butter with about 2 feet high. Wheels of butter, which they cut on. It smelled so good. It doesn't smell like that today. And it isn't because I'm older. It's really that I don't remember, but once in a great while, I'll hit a flavor, but it isn't the same.
One of the things I like about the shops at that time, when you see the pictures of Jamestown, downtown Jamestown at that time, were the awnings, the cloth awnings that all of the shops had out over the front of their stores. That I would love to see us go back to having those kinds of awnings to protect things from the sun.
Were there a lot of different businesses represented on Main Street? Was it?
Oh yes, I know. There's nothing that's in existence any longer, but there were, furniture, clothing of all kinds, just every kind of store imaginable, just as there is today. Banks, music stores, haberdasheries. We don't have haberdasheries particularly. Nobody wears hats. It was an era of hats, both men's and women's hats, and so you would have stores that were solely hat stores, which are no longer in business because it's not stylish to wear hats.
Actually, they had a lot of stores. They had a lot of men's stores for clothing because the men would buy ready-made things. The women still preferred buying their material, having a dressmaker come to the house with some patterns and making a dress just for them. They didn't really want any of the ready-made things. They had a lot of produce markets, meat markets. The banks were downtown. There were lawyers in the offices above the buildings. And if you notice, a lot of the buildings that are down, and I'm thinking just along Main Street now, have been there since the city began or shortly thereafter, and you can tell that by looking at the dates at the top of them. We tend to think of our business district as 3rd Street, 4th Street, and yet actually around the time the city started, it was more 1st Street, 2nd Street, going on up to 3rd. And when you got up to 4th, you started getting into the residential areas, and maybe where some of the churches were. So it just shifted a little bit, went a little bit higher as the years have gone on.
There, in old maps, I see a swamp downtown. Can you tell us where that was or where it is now?
It would cover just about the whole business district if you really want to know the truth. It was very, very swampy. In fact, I remember reading a story about how whenever a cow was lost, they just assumed it got lost in the swamp and they wouldn't even go out looking for it. It was so bad. So, sometimes you wonder how much Jamestown is built on if you know that there's a swamp under all those buildings and all those streets up there.
All 3rd Street, 2nd
all
Street?
All 3rd Street, 2nd Street, over between, I want to say, Washington and Maine. That whole area was a swamp.
when I went to Art Metal to work, they asked me if I wanted to work in the office, in the factory, or in the real office. And I said, where's the most money? They said, in the factory, so if you don't mind getting dirty. I said, all right, I'll work in the factory.
And what'd you do there?
Well, I was over the timekeepers. And I did figure out some of it.
When I was 13 years old, I had to quit school and go to work. And I worked for the family of Curtis that used to have the Curtis Manufacturing down on East 2nd Street. And I worked for them for about a year and a half. And I worked for $3 a week, did all the housework, and did the cooking and ironing and everything. The woman told me, she says, if I knew that you weren't any older than you were, I wouldn't have paid you as much as I did. At that time, the biggest manufacturer they had here was the Salisbury Wheel Works, and that moved out. And in time, they had the furniture factories, the woolen factories, and they had quite a few furniture factories, which was a main industry then for Jamestown.
Jamestown was a large industrial city at that particular time, and they offered jobs to people that were willing to work. Well, I think most people are familiar with the mills, the fact that we made a lot of woolen material, flax material, linens. Because it's not around today, I think that people need to be reminded of that, because certainly the furniture, we still think of Jamestown as a furniture city.
Right around the turn of the century, the really big industry that was in existence then in Jamestown was the wood furniture, which the Swedish immigrants were not totally responsible for, but had a lot to do with. These things, again, were like the stores. They were small, locally owned shops. That was the primary industry, but there were other smaller industries of all kinds. Name it, it's been made in Jamestown at some point in time in Jamestown's history.
Washing machines.
But, yes, oh yes. Since 1851, I believe, the first washing machine factory that was established. Bricks go back, and that's the Broadhead family again. The brick shale paving company made all the bricks that paved the streets of Jamestown, and there we're talking, the 1880s. Film, American Aristotype, established in 1889. Chairman of the board was George Eastman, and that ultimately, the capital for that was put up by a local attorney, Porter Sheldon. The Sheldon Foundation in Jamestown is an inheritor of American Aristotype, and the acquisition by Eastman Kodak of the American Aristotype operation. Boats go back to 1820s. I can't come up with the exact year off the top of my head. And perhaps even earlier with the keel boats that possibly were manufactured here back in the 18-teens, at the keelboat landing down there.
So Jamestown was a very, very industrial city then.
Absolutely, absolutely. From its beginnings with the sawmills, that it was industry, not farming, it was industry. And it just went from one thing to another as times change. Industry in Jamestown changes to go along with it.
There's no disputing the fact that Jamestown was a very industrial town. The city paid tribute to its industry in the 1927 Centennial Parade. Watch for all the industrial floats in this film shot by Jamestown's Mr. Telephone, John Wright.
There was a lot of industrial activity. Yes, because the Industrial Revolution hit Jamestown, if I remember correctly, just about 1860, between 60 and 70, around in there. And so that Jamestown got into the furniture situation, and then the English came, and they had the cotton mills and the woolen mills, and so there was a lot of industry. And Broadhead was responsible for, and there was that Broadhead mill there on First Street, and of course he put in the streetcars and all that. But so those things were there when I became old enough to see them.
Of course, there were the worsted mills, which the Broadheads had established, and William Hull had established in the 1870s, and they employed the greatest number of people, like 1,000 to 1,500 people.
What was it like working in the mills at that point in time? Was it all women? Was it children? Was it men?
All of those. I think they did, they hired the men, I think, to do the heavier work, and it was mostly men. I think the women and the children they hired especially to do the fine work with the fingers, in the mills, with the looms, and the work that required a lot of dexterity and speed, because I think that they worked what we might call piecework and were paid by the amount that they could get done. And Sam Carlson, in one of his books, he worked in a mill for a while in his early days, he speaks of the poor children who were always being told to hurry up to get the work done. Of course, the hours were long. They worked from sunrise till sundown, and working conditions probably weren't very good.
You say children. How young are you talking about, Helen?
Well, I think before there were any state laws or regulations about hiring children, probably children 7, 8, 9 years old went to work in the factories, particularly if their parents worked there. They probably went along to the factories and got started doing maybe just little errands and carrying things, and gradually learned by being there how to work some of the machines, to do some of that fine work with their quick fingers.
Everyone in town has seen the Furniture Mart building, but how many of you remember the inside of the building, in its prime? Looking back at a brochure that was printed for one of the expositions, you can see why Jamestown is remembered as a furniture center. The list of exhibitors included such familiar names as the Maddox Table Company and the A.C. Nordquist Company, as well as many obscure companies such as the Acme, Active, and Anchor Furniture Company. The list of items include the standard tables, chairs, and bedroom furniture that one normally associates with this area. But other items are not so familiar, such as radio cabinets, cedar chest, and parlor tables. All were on exhibit, but very few local people ever saw them, since the expo catered to dealers.
So we went to Celeron, and there we took in all of the rides. And And so we had a good day. And we took our food and picnicked. And then we could go ahead and for a nickel you could shoot down rabbits or you shoot down something. There were all kinds of little booths that they still have at carnivals, I understand. I
Right.
haven't seen any for a long time.
Oh, they still do.
They still do, yes.
They used to go swimming too, there, and they had these things that you could ride down, way out in the water. Some of them would belly whack down, and some would, the girl would be straddled the guy's back, and he'd probably throw her off.
Practically lived in Selwyn Park. We used to go down, they had a stock company in this theater that was there, and they changed the show every week, and every week we had to be there to see that show. And it was, sometimes they'd have run a movie, it was continuous, and we had to keep up with the continuation of that so we didn't miss any of it.
The one in Celeron, which was established in the early 1890s, was a beautiful piece of well, it was a theater, and it had a drop curtain, and it had all kinds of scenery changes. The pictures, I've seen pictures of that, and red gold plush decoration in white and gold, and then red plush seats with balconies. And I imagine that's how the houses here in Jamestown were also. Just a great deal of money was spent on those, and of course they had changing shows every week. They would have live entertainments in musicals and dramas. A lot of that kind of thing went on in the last half of the last century. The people could go really be entertained.
We'd go down there, and the streetcar used to run right clear out to the end of the steamboat dock and carry passengers out there, and there was always an enormous crowd down there. And they had all kind of bands that come there, all the famous bands. And some of the New York Stock Company used to play in there, and then in the Pier Ballroom, they turned that into a big dance hall. And they used to have a big ball that hung from the ceiling. It was all made of little pieces of glass put together. And they'd turn the lights on that and shut the other lights off, and it'd be just like rainbows running all over the floor. It's what they called the moonlight dance. And that place was a beautiful place.
Celeron Park was fantastic in its day, and that's, I'm thinking, right around the turn of the century. There was a Ferris wheel, there was roller coaster rides. You could get in your bathing suit and go down the water slides. I think water slides are new for 1980. They're not, they were around a long time ago. Just fun things. They'd have music. They had a fountain that had lights and different colors that they would turn on at night. They had fireworks. They had a mini zoo. There was just a lot of things to keep people busy. There were baseball games. They had a baseball field out there, that kind of thing. So, you could spend the whole day there and just be really pleased with what you saw.
Celeron Park was one of those parks that was called a trolley park, simply because it was easy for people to get to, a very short ride on the trolley. It was patronized very largely, from what I have been able to find out, by people from Jamestown and the surrounding area. It was not terribly expensive. If you could afford the price of a trolley ride or a steamboat ride from Jamestown, that's all you needed. You didn't have to buy admission to the park. If you wanted to ride the giant Ferris wheel or the roller coaster types they had, some of those special events, it would cost 10 cents. But otherwise, you could sit in the midway and watch trapeze artists and balloon ascension, fireworks, band concerts, all sorts of entertainments just by sitting there and paying nothing.
Celeron Park was an amusement park. It was the Coney Island of western New York, and that was established by the Broadhead family, who owned the steamboat lines and who owned some of those trolley lines also, along with some other things in the city of Jamestown, other industries. Chautauqua Lake was a tourist mecca, just as it is now, but people came and stayed for the whole summer. The Broadhead family, the two sons of William, Almed and Sheldon, who saw this tourist trade all around Chautauqua Lake at Chautauqua Institution, which was established at this time, and saw the need for these people of having something to do, besides just sit around and chat or play cards or whatever they would do. So they established this huge amusement park at Celeron. But they had the Ferris wheel, the Phoenix wheel as it was called, and when it left Celeron Park, when that was closed finally, that Phoenix wheel went out to Sacramento, California, and was there until, it's perhaps 5 years ago or so that it burned there in California at the amusement park where it was there. But that was a huge thing. There were all sorts of the typical rides that any amusement park has. Early on, there was a lot of vaudeville. There was a theater there that brought in a lot of vaudeville.
I'll tell you, in those days, the factories had policies of providing tickets for their workers. And then their workers could go there and take free rides and all kinds of things with these tickets. All the families would meet there, and we had one grand big time. It was really fun. They did this for years, these factories. And it was a sort of a bonus, I suppose, or a way of keeping the people happy with low pay. I don't know. But I know the pay was pretty low.
In the younger days, they had 4 streetcars running around Jamestown. There was 2 big trolley cars. One of them was the JNW. It used to run from Jamestown as far as Westville, carrying baggage and passengers, and they met the trains in Westville. And the Chautauqua traction, which ran up on the south side of the lake, that went as far as Mayville and carried the people up to the courthouse and the farmers that lived along the road. And in Jamestown itself, we had 2 trolleys here. One little short trolley that ran from Jamestown up as far as Asheville and turned around and came back. And then we had a little tiny one that used to go up and down the loop, which was up North Main Street, past the cemetery, and came back down Lakeview Avenue.
Now, was that horse-drawn or electric at that time?
All electric. Broadhead had, at that time, had built the power plant, and they furnished the power for the electricity of Jamestown and up as far as Celeron. And then that one big trolley, after it came back from Mayville, it went on through to Warren, Pennsylvania, and came back.
You mentioned the train, and are you using train and railway synonymously? Or are you interchanging those terms? You said the train ran around the lake.
Yes, the one that ran on the east side of the lake at the earliest times was a steam train. The one that the Chautauqua traction line that ran around the west side of the lake was an electric train, an extension actually of the Jamestown Street Railway Company, which was, those were electric cars, trolleys actually.
Trolley system was very, very well developed, and it tied in. Eventually, the Broadhead family owned most of the trolley systems and the steamboat system, so that's why they even had Celeron Park, was to encourage people to use the trolleys and the steamers and to get more business, build up more business. So you could pretty much get all over town just hopping a trolley whenever you wanted to.
Through the winter also?
Oh yeah, through the winter. It was a little cold and nippy, but yeah, you could even do it in the wintertime.
And they were open cars pulled by horses?
The first ones were, and then eventually it was, electricity was used as a means of power, and the cars were closed. They even had some double-decker cars that went out to Celeron Park.
These streetcars they run up there is what they call the open cars. The seats were all open with just a rail on either side to keep people from falling off. And then they had one streetcar that ran up there. They had an upstairs to it and a winding stairway that went up to get to the second floor. They called the double-decker. And kids delighted in getting up there to ride on that.
Part of this whole thing, too, are the steamboats that were on Chautauqua Lake, which also helped connect this whole transportation thing, because some people would take the steamboat, say, from Celeron Park up to Mayville, taking the trolley from Jamestown to Celeron and then picking up one of the steamboats at the Celeron dock. And the trolley line ran all the way out to the end of the dock at Celeron Park, so that you could just climb off the trolley and ride on, just walk a few feet across the dock that was there and ride onto the steamboat, and then travel up to, say, Mayville or someplace in between, Bemis or whatever.
And you have to recognize how important that was. I mean, for instance, the dock at Mayville and at Celeron, you know, the trains or the trolleys could pull right out on the dock.
Oh,
So
really?
you could leave Pittsburgh by train, come right out on the dock at Mayville, get off the train, onto the steamboat, and down to the hotel where you were staying for the summer.
I really miss the trains. I really do. I think in this industrialization that we have and in this computerized era, we really have missed something, and that is the train. They were really nice.
Railroad Bill, where have you been? Been around the world, Lord, I'm going back again. Let him ride, my Railroad Bill. Railroad Bill got so mean, ran all them people out in New Orleans. He's a bad, bad outlaw man. Railroad Bill waiting for a freight. Poor Railroad Bill, Lord, he's just too late. Let him ride, Railroad Bill.
When looking through old photographs, you find that people took pictures of things that they were really proud of. After polishing the chrome, or wood in this case, Jamestown's firefighters would stand with their rigs, smile, and say, "Ain't she sweet?"
Chautauqua Lake also made ice in the wintertime. I kept the people that were busy in the summertime with the tourists. That was what their occupation was most of the time in the wintertime. And they had a whole system for cutting it, harvesting it, conveyor belts that got it up into the ice houses. Then they'd store it with straw to pack it and insulate it, and then of course as soon as they needed it, when it got to be spring and summer, they'd unpack it and ship it down to Pittsburgh, up to Buffalo, to Cleveland, wherever it was needed.
They cut a canal from the bank out to the deepest part of the lake where they were cutting, maybe about 5 to 6 feet wide. And then they'd saw both sides of that and saw down through so they got it into blocks. And then the men that worked there would stand on either side of the canal. They had long pike poles with a long iron spike in the end of it. And they'd gradually push these things up until they got it almost to the bank, where they had a revolving chain there that would catch that ice and haul it right up into the ice house. And when they got it up in there, they made a layer of it across, and then they'd pack sawdust on that. And then another layer of ice, and pack more sawdust until they got the ice house filled. And sometimes they took the horses out on there to help push those cakes up.
Thought I heard that steamboat whistle blow. Thought I heard that steamboat whistle blow. Blowed like she'd never blowed before.
These graduates, or to be, would take the boat and go up to Midway, and on the way, it would be in the evening, maybe if I remember correctly, maybe 7:30, 8 o'clock, and we would dance and eat on the boat, and there would be the dance band, of course. We had a very good time, and they called this the Vigil. And there would be a few programs, very simple, which I can't remember, just simple things, And then we would go on and then circle the lake. I don't think we went to Midway at that time. I'm not positive about it. And then I don't think we got off the boat. I think we just simply turned around up to the Mayville, close to Mayville, and back. It took a long, long time. It took the whole evening. We'd get off. It would be quite late.
My family moved here in 1946. We moved to a home on the shores of the lake in Lakewood. And at that time, the last remaining steamer on the lake, the city of Jamestown, was still in operation. So frequently I used to sit in my dock and watch the city of Jamestown go by, and it was kind of a great experience for me because, there's so much color and character and romance to steamboats. It's just a fascinating sight for almost anyone who watches it. When was the absolute heyday of the steamboats? Well, I'd say it came shortly after President Grant's visit and the beginning of Chautauqua Institution. In 1879 through 1881, 82, there were a half dozen of the major steamboats built. Remember, we had the early steamboats were flat-bottom paddle wheelers because we didn't have big docks that they could pull into, so they had to come right into shore. But they were very slow. So the latter-day fleet, and really the fleet that we call the Great White Fleet, it was built in the 1879 through 1891. And these were V-hull, fast, deep-water boats, and we could use them because we had these huge piers, big docks coming out into the lake, so they didn't have to come right into shore. In some cases, channels were dug to accommodate them too. So I'd say the heyday of the fleet really took place in the 1880s, 1890s, right up through 1892 when the Broadhead brothers bought the two competing fleets on the lake. We had the Red Stack Line and the Black Stack Line, and they used to have all fantastic competitions. Price wars. I mean, they were tough people. Occasionally they would shoot at each other. There were some interesting things that went on. I mean, we think business is competitive today. It was just as competitive then. But in 1892, the Broadhead brothers bought both the Red Stack Line and the Black Stack Line, and combined the two into one fleet, and that was the salvation of the steamboating. It went on in a very substantial manner from then through the early part of the 1900s, and around 1910 started going downhill. 1915 started going downhill until the fleet was out of business in 1925.
I rode all the steamboats. We used to go from Jamestown to Mayville and back for 80 cents. Sunday afternoon, that was a special treat to get on there, and they had a little German band that would play on the boat all the way from Jamestown to Mayville and back. And people just crowded the boat ride just to hear that band play.
People were such great promoters in those times, too.
How's that?
See, an entrepreneur would build a steamboat. He would immediately make a connection with a railroad line, and he would name the steamboat after one of the main people involved with the railroad. Okay, and that would last for a year or two, just to get that monetary connection between railroad passengers and steamboat passengers. Our people in those days were such great promoters that after they would make the connection with the railroads, they would name the steamboats after the great cities where tourists came from. The latter-day fleet, the Great White Fleet, we had the city of Pittsburgh, the city of Chicago, the city of Cleveland, the city of New York, all of the major cities around here where people could easily get to Lake Chautauqua.
They weren't just being gracious.
I think they were being a little bit gracious, but I guess perhaps the monetary factor was rather important also.
At one particular time, the 1880s and 90s, there were 7 very large steamboats, well over 100 feet long. This does not include the one called the Jamestown, which had 4 decks in its final years, would carry something like 3,000 to 5,000 people. And it burned in 1891. That was the end of it. That was the very largest one that they had.
Where did they get 3,000 to 5,000 people to ride on?
Well, apparently people flocked here from in the country in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Buffalo. Excursions would come from Buffalo, from the cities of Pittsburgh and Cleveland, Buffalo also. That's the only place I can think, the only way I can think they could get that many people. But it was for the special excursions. I look at the pictures and I see the 7 huge steamers plus many smaller ones all drawn up there, and I don't quite see how they all fit, because it doesn't look like there's that much space, and yet people tell me that that was the size of the boat landing, because I thought maybe that it had been a bigger body of water that they had been able to use, but they say it was that size. It hasn't been filled in or anything.
Unbelievable, isn't it? And it really hasn't changed that much either. I mean, there's probably more room down there right now than there was before. They could actually turn in the boat landing. They sort of had to winch them around on the docks. You know, you would tie one of the big lines to one of the huge dock posts and swing the bow out, and then work the boat around in that manner. You couldn't actually just turn in the circle. It's not that large.
You know, it's incredible when you see pictures of it to realize that that's where the steamboats landed. And I look at it and I think, how could they possibly have fit that many steamers? But they all lined up. People would actually take the trolley down to the boat landing to get on the steamboat, and then the steamers would, you know, they all had their scheduled times. There was some boat building done there. The repairs were done there during the winter time down in that area. And then the steamer would take off down the outlet. I don't know, I think there are like 9 curves. And you can see where it was very difficult to navigate all the way, just like this, the whole way down. And it did take them a while to get out, actually out into Chautauqua Lake from there.
Thought I heard that steamboat whistle blow. Thought I heard that steamboat whistle blow. Blowed like she'd never blowed before.
The Jamestown of today is quite different than that of the turn of the century. Many of the things that you've just seen and heard about are no longer with us. The obvious question is why? The answers? Well, they're not quite as black and white as the photos of that period.
At one time, it was thought that the Depression did in that wood furniture industry. We discovered that the wood furniture industry had gone into decline before the great crash in 1929. Many of those small family-owned businesses were already going out of business or being absorbed by larger companies. And the reason for that was technology. They were very small, they had very little capital investment behind them. Technology was increasing. They did not have the capital to invest in the technology that was necessary. They relied on hand labor, and that was becoming obsolete. You simply could not produce the goods by hand labor economically. You had to do it by machinery. They could not invest in that machinery. And in some instances, say the father who had started the business originally, he had died or retired. The sons had no interest in, or there were no sons to continue the business, or those had no interest in continuing it, so it just fell by the wayside.
When was the downfall of Celeron Park, do you know?
Oh, I think it happened gradually, and I think this is what happened basically throughout all of around Chautauqua Lake. We had these very large hotels, and once the automobile became popular and most people had a car, they could go any place they wanted. They weren't restricted by railroads, steamers, trolleys, and could only go where they could get. They could go any place they wanted, and I think this is primarily they wanted to go farther, they could go farther, and that's what they did. They didn't have to just stick to the same places they had gone to.
I think you can trace that, directly to the tremendous development of the railroad system. We, at one time had trains around both sides of the lake, and very particularly to the automobile. Once the automobile came out and roads started being built around the lake and it was easier to get around, you could do it year-round, the steamboats started going downhill until eventually in 1925, the Broadhead brothers, who were the salvation of the steamboat fleet on this lake in the early part of the century, took the entire fleet out of commission. From that point on, the city of Jamestown was sold to private individuals, and that particular boat maintained the tradition right through 1963, which was the last regularly scheduled run, and 1967 when it actually made its last run on the lake.
The Jamestown of today is quite different than that of yesterday. It's easy to feel nostalgic about our past. The glamour of the boats, the simplicity of the trolleys. But while interviewing people that lived in the early days of this century, we found very few that felt life then was much better. Primarily just different. To appreciate the thrill of riding a buggy up Main Street, you also had to deal with the mud and slippery cobblestones. Work in the mills meant hard work, long hours, and low pay. The city continued to change throughout this century. Downtown continued to move up Main Street. Movies replaced vaudeville in the theaters. The horses and trolley moved over to make room for the automobile. Some industry moved out, others changed, and new ones moved in. Today, Jamestown is a mixture of old and new. We have banks with a century of history, and new companies banking on the history of this century. The technology of the 1800s has grown and prospered. Century-old buildings are being put to new uses, while others are being restored to their original splendor. An area that was once known as the Rapids and was discovered by accident has given birth to a city that has grown and prospered for over 100 years.
This program has been brought to you by Alltel of New York. The telephone has been a part of Jamestown since 1880, when shop was set up in Hatch and Crane. Throughout the years, the city has grown, and Alltel is proud to have grown with it. And Chase Lincoln First. As the First National Bank, Chase Lincoln has been serving this community since 1853. Since the days when Governor Fenton worked at the bank, Chase Lincoln has been proud to be a part of Jamestown and looks forward to another 100 years of history. And the Roe B. Henderson Insurance Agency. The third generation is now serving the needs of this community with the same care and concern of the original founders. The Roe B. Henderson Insurance Agency.